Hello and welcome to this video on using sources. In this video, we will take a look at how to integrate sources in your writing. So there are three different ways in which you can integrate sources into your writing. You can either summarize, paraphrase, or quote. You summarize when you need to give an overview of the entire source to orient your reader, or when you want to provide background information that leads to the point of the paper. You paraphrase when you need to provide supporting fact or detail, but the original writer's exact words are not important. Like you can put them in your own words and not sacrifice losing meaning. When you need to use just one specific idea from a source and the rest of the source is not as important. Here you choose paraphrasing. When do you quote? You quote when you are discussing the wording, when you risk losing the essence of the author's ideas if you put them in your own words, when you want to appeal to the authority of the author, or when the original wording is so remarkable that the paraphrasing would diminish it. How do you paraphrase? Paraphrasing gives a detailed overview of a source's important ideas. For that, you use your own words. Shouldn't look at the source as you write. Just read the source twice and then look away and then try to put it in your own words. Use language and syntax that come naturally to you. It should sound like you. Avoid duplicating the phrasing or sentence structure of the original. Use synonyms or, for important terms, quote. Reflect the ideas of the source, not your analysis or interpretation, so it has to be original, and include parenthetical documentation. This is an example of a plagiarized paraphrase, and on the left of the screen you can see the original wording, and on the right it shows you the paraphrase, but it sounds plagiarized because so many of the original terms were used and the author kept the order of the sentences the same way, the structure of the sentences, etc. You can pause the screen and read them. This would be an acceptable paraphrase. As for summarizing, a brief restatement of the main ideas of a passage or article are enough, then you summarize. How do you do that? You omit examples as asides, analogies, and rhetorical strategies. You use your own words, not the exact language or phrasing of the source. You include one main idea, only the main ideas of the source, not your own interpretations or opinions. You include parenthetical documentation as well. For quoting, you need to integrate correctly and smoothly into the sentence, and you have to discuss them in relation to the rest of the paragraph. You can't just insert a quote in there and expect it to work. It's magic. It's not going to happen that way. We'll see in a second how you introduce a quote and how you wrap it up and link it. It has to be formatted correctly and used correctly, grammatical and sentence structure wise. And it should be a maximum of 10% of your paper, and there shouldn't be any freestanding quotes. Let's take a look at how you integrate a quote. Quotes can never stand by themselves. They must be introduced and explained. So we call them sandwiching quotes. You introduce the quote, then you talk about the relevance. Take a look at this one here. O'Brien's character in his novel, The Things They Carried, is able to sort through his emotions by writing about what he experienced in Vietnam. The method of storytelling is effective for him because by telling stories, here's where the quote is, by telling stories, you objectify your own experience. You separate it from yourself. You pin down certain truths. And it also gives me the page number. Then you have to say why this is relevant, whatever you're saying. His stories thus become a type of therapy for him where O'Brien can discover the lessons he learned without feeling directly involved. So how do you integrate sources? First of all, you have to introduce the quotation with a complete sentence and a colon. Example, In Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau states directly his purpose for going into the woods, colon, then you put the quotes, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived. Full stop, close quote. There is another way to do it. You can say Thoreau's philosophy might be summed up best by his repeated request for people to ignore the insignificant details of life, colon, open quotation marks. Our life is frittered away by detail. An honest man has hardly need to count more than his 10 fingers, or in extreme cases, he may add his 10 toes and lump the rest. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Exclamation mark, close quotations. Or you can say, Thoreau ends his essay with a metaphor, colon, and then you state it. This is an easy rule to remember. If you use a complete sentence to introduce a quotation, you need a colon after the sentence. Be careful not to confuse a colon, which are two dots above one another, with a semicolon, which is a comma and a dot on top of it. Using a comma in this situation will most likely create a comma splice. Method 2. You use an introductory or explanatory phrase, but not a complete sentence, separated from the quotation with a comma. So, for example, in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau states directly his purpose for going into the woods when he says, comma, open quotation marks, I went to the woods because I wish to live deliberately. Same thing with the second example. Thoreau suggests the consequences of making ourselves slaves to progress when he says, comma, open quotation marks, and you state the quote. So you should use a comma to separate your own words from the quotation when your introductory or explanatory phrase ends with a verb, such as says or said, thinks or thought, believes or believed, pondered, recalled. So when do you use the present tense and when do you use the past tense? If you're using MLA, you use the simple present tense. If you're using APA, you use the past tense. You should also use a comma when you introduce a quotation with a phrase such as according to Thoreau. Method 3. Make the quotation a part of your own sentence without any punctuation between your own words and the words you are quoting. For example, in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau states directly his purpose for going into the woods when he says that I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, etc. Notice that the word that is used in 3 of the examples above, and when it is used as it is in the examples, that replaces the comma, which would be necessary without that in the sentence. You usually have a colon. Then, when you begin a sentence with a phrase such as Thoreau says, you either can add a comma after says, or you can add the word that with no comma. Thoreau says that, and then you quote. Method number 4. Use short quotations, only a few words, as part of your own sentence. For example, in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau states that his retreat to the woods around Walden Pond was motivated by his desire, between quotes, to live deliberately and to face only, between quotes, the essential facts of life. Here I'm using more than 3 words or more from Thoreau, and so I need to quote his exact words. Let's take a look at one more example. Although Thoreau, and then here we're quoting, drinks at the stream of time, comma, he can, between quotes, detect how shallow it is. When I'm using his exact words, I have to quote them. So when you integrate quotations in this way, you do not use any special punctuation. Instead, you should punctuate the sentence just as you would if all the words were your own. No punctuation is needed in sentences above, in part because the sentences do not follow the pattern explained under number 1 and 2 above. There is not a complete sentence in front of the quotations, and the word such as says, said, or asks, did not appear directly in front of the quoted words. All of the methods above for integrating quotations are correct, but you should avoid over-relying too much on just one method. You should instead use a variety of methods. For punctuation, there are two punctuation marks that are used to introduce quotes: the comma and the colon. If there are no parenthetical citations in the sentences, the commas and periods go inside the final quotation mark, like this, full stop, close quotation marks. Semicolons and colons go outside of the final quotation mark, like this. Question marks and exclamation points go outside the final quotation mark if the punctuation mark is part of your sentence, your question, your exclamation. Those marks go inside the final quotation mark if they are part of the original, the writer's question, or exclamation, like this. In the next video, we're going to be talking about documentation, in-text citation, list of works cited, and references.